Hi, everyone. I'm Samantha Massell. I'm so excited to be your host today for this celebration of life. I'm an actor and a singer, and I have been an MC now for the Susan Mendez Foundation for a couple of years, and it is always such a thrill, the most incredible stories, the most amazing presentations. Um, and I have to tell you, I've done this a bunch of times, and I am beyond thrilled for today. I feel very, very lucky to be sharing this Zoom room with our speakers and with all of you. Um, by the way, I don't know if you guys have noticed, but today the Susan Mendez Foundation is the lead story in the forward, which is a huge deal. So not only are we celebrating life, but we are celebrating Susan Mendez. That is incredible. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the anonymous sponsor of today's program, who made it possible for so many more people to hear this extraordinary story. We are beyond grateful. And also, if you're wondering where Olivia and Mordecai are, don't worry, you'll see them very soon. When Olivia asked me to join you this evening, I was sent a link to Stephen Pressman's film, 50 Children, The Rescue Mission of Mr. and Mrs. Kraus. And I clicked the link, and once I saw it, I just knew I had to be involved with today. I found the film riveting. The story is extraordinary, and the bravery of the Kraus family is so inspiring. It has simply not left my mind since I watched it. And so while I could gush aimlessly for the full hour of this talk, I will spare you all and instead introduce our extraordinary speakers. And I'm very, very grateful to be sharing this Zoom with them today. Our first speaker is filmmaker Stephen Pressman, and he is the man, the myth, the legend who presented this story to the world. He's a hero in this story because he's the one who has brought this story to life. And this story, prior to Stephen's work, was completely unknown. In addition to directing and producing 50 Children, The Rescue Mission of Mr. and Mrs. Kraus, which premiered on HBO in 2013 and received an Emmy nomination for Outstanding Historical Programming, he is also the author of 50 Children, One Ordinary American Couple's Extraordinary Rescue Mission into the Heart of Nazi Germany, which, by the way, is a book that will be sent to you as a thank you gift if you sign up for the season ticket to the Susan Mendez Foundation's upcoming 2023 program. So I definitely recommend you guys do that. His film Holy Silence had its broadcast premiere in PBS on PBS in 2020, and and his next film, The Levies of Monticello, has been screening at film festivals this past year. Additionally, he has not just worked as a filmmaker, he has also had a long career in journalism. And Stephen's going to be up here today with our extra special second guest, who I'm overjoyed and honored to introduce, Paul Beller. Paul was born in Vienna, Austria in 1931, and he is one of the 50 children that was rescued by Gilbert and Eleanor Kraus. And since you all have seen the film, you may recognize his face because he is featured in the film. Paul and his wife, Glenda, who I want to give an extra special shout out to, have been married for an astonishing 66 years. I mean, mazel tov, that's incredible. They have 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and 7 great-grandchildren. Mind-boggling. We are so very lucky today to get to hear his personal story. And with that, I will turn the floor over to Stephen and Paul.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Samantha. It is it's such a thrill to be part of this program today, and just want to thank profusely the Susan Mendez Foundation, Olivia, for making this possible and for being part of this opportunity to share what I still think, after all these years of talking about this film, I never get tired of talking about the story of Gil and Eleanor Kraus, and it's a particular delight today to be able to talk about this story with Paul, who I've now known for over 10 years now. I've had the privilege of knowing Paul and Glenda ever since I was first working on the film several years ago, and it's just a real thrill for me to be sharing the stage today, our virtual stage together with Paul, to talk a little bit about the story of Gil and Eleanor Kraus. I know that most people who are watching us today hopefully have had a chance now to see the film, but we thought we would start off for the first few minutes of today's program just kind of reviewing a little bit about who these people were. So for the next few minutes, I'd like to talk a little bit about Gil and Eleanor Kraus, and then I'll bring in Paul and turn the platform over to Paul as we move to his story. So as many of you know from watching the film, Gil and Eleanor Kraus were what I always like to consider as very unlikely heroes. They were a couple from Philadelphia. They were not what I would call wealthy, but they certainly were a couple of means. They very much enjoyed their lives. You can tell by looking at them that they were a very handsome couple. Eleanor Kraus in particular always loved the finer things in life in Philadelphia. She always enjoyed wearing fancy hats, and as you can tell in this photograph, standing in front of their house, not far from Philadelphia's fashionable Rittenhouse Square. She enjoyed fine clothes. It looks like she's wearing either a mink or a fox stole around her neck. They were a handsome couple, and they were a very unlikely couple to have carried out this rescue mission in Philadelphia in the winter and spring of 1939. They did have help. Again, as some of you will recall from the film, a dear friend of theirs, a very prominent Philadelphia pediatrician named Dr. Robert Schless, was a very prominent pediatrician in Philadelphia, and more importantly, he was not only a friend of the Krauses, but he was their children's pediatrician. And Dr. Schless, to be perfectly honest, deserves a story and a movie and a book all his own. I learned a great deal about Dr. Schless when I was doing the research for my film and book, and he truly was a hero. He had done pioneering work in the public health field in Philadelphia prior to this. He started out as one of the first flight surgeons for the U.S. Navy way back in the early years of the 20th century, truly a hero in his own right. And he was very much a part of the children's rescue mission that Gil and Eleanor Kraus embarked upon that brought them to Vienna in the spring of 1939. You know, the other remarkable thing I think about Gil and Eleanor as they went off to try to rescue a group of Jewish children for Vienna is they did so by very bravely leaving behind their own two children. Gil and Eleanor Kraus had two young children at the time of this rescue mission in the early months of 1939. There's Gil with their young daughter, Ellen, named basically after her mother. There was Big Ellen and Little Ellen. Ellen holding hands with her father in the photograph you're seeing on the screen is probably about 6 or 7 years old at the time. The picture on the left, when I first saw this picture, to be perfectly honest, I thought I was looking at another picture of a girl, but indeed that's their son, Stephen, who at the time of the rescue mission was actually a little older than this photograph. Stephen Kraus was about 13 years old in 1939. But I always loved this photograph of Eleanor. I don't know for sure, but I think this photograph may well have been taken on the boardwalk in Atlantic City. Stephen looks to be maybe 7 or 8 years old. But again, it's just always been one of my favorite photos of the Krauses. But I love these two photos because, again, it kind of highlights their own bravery in not only going into Nazi Germany to carry out this rescue mission, but to make that very difficult decision in doing so to leave behind their two children in the care of other family members. They didn't just leave their two kids behind, But it was a very brave thing of them to do, and I've always kept in mind the bravery of Gil and Eleanor Kraus as they embarked upon this mission. From one family to another, here's where the story very dramatically transitions to a whole new set of families, the families of the children in Vienna that the Krauses found themselves surrounded by. Here I'd like to turn the podium over to Paul, who you're about to see as a very, very young boy surrounded by some very handsome members of his family. So Paul, with that, why don't I turn it over to you and have you introduce who we're seeing on the screen.
Hi, I just thought I'd give you a little background on the family you see in front of you. This happens to be a wedding picture. The couple in the middle were being married. That's my Uncle Emil, and the other gentleman on the left is Uncle Max. And in front, I have my grandparents, and on the top right are my parents. The little guy in the middle who needs a haircut is Paul Beller. So that's who we are, and they were celebrating the wedding of one of my uncles.
Very good. Paul, we're going to next see a photograph that you're very familiar with, and as that comes up on the screen, why don't you tell us a little bit about your early years in Vienna before things were turning bad? Because in a few minutes we're going to talk a little bit more about those very, very difficult times. But why don't you tell us what we're seeing on the screen right now?
Well, right now you see a document which you have to have in order to leave the country. In German, it's known as the Reisepass. And what it actually is, it outlines who you are and your date of birth and various other information about you. And it's listed me as a scholar, as a student, and that I was born in Vienna and various other things about me. Now, what we have here is already at the point of leaving Vienna with the children, but what we had before was when I was born in Vienna in peaceful times, long before Hitler, which was in 1931. Hitler first took over in Germany a little bit later, and he didn't come into Austria until March of 38, when they did the annexation, which in German meant the Anschluss. And at that time, of course, Jews lost virtually all their rights. They lost their properties, like our business was taken over. We had a very good business that supported 3 families in the wood industry. And then after that, we were just left to ourselves to see if we could get visas, because if we didn't get visas, we'd probably wind up in the death camps. That was the way and the tragic way that things were going at the time. But I was living a pretty comfortable and happy life until March of 38. I was the only child. My parents took good care of me, and then they had a good life, a comfortable life, a Vienna life, which means nice Vienna enjoyment and relaxation and coffee and everything else. But then it went radically in the other direction when people were afraid for their lives, and many of them never did survive.
Paul, when Gil and Eleanor Kraus showed up with Dr. Schless in Vienna, and now this is the spring of 1939, so you were 8 or 9 years old. What are your memories of the Krauses? What are your memories of beginning to understand that your parents were trying to send you away to safety with this strange couple going to this strange place called the United States of America? I'm real curious what your memories are as a young boy about to encounter that strange experience for you.
Well, to tell you the truth, it was a little different than it sounds, because my mother protected me, and she told me I was going to visit relatives in the Bronx in New York. She wasn't telling me that I might never see them again and that the Nazis were looking to exterminate the Jews. So I was living in a somewhat happy state. And when they interviewed me, and they asked me if I was willing to travel to the United States by myself. I said yes, because I'm going to be visiting some relatives in the Bronx. And also, they asked me some questions about how I felt about life in general. Like they offered me a candy to take. I was basically a wise guy as a kid. And instead of taking the candy, I asked my mother for permission to take the candy. And they thought that was a very nice gesture. And later she said to me, Pauli, that's not you. You're a wise guy. How come you did this? And I said, you know, I just thought it was the right thing at the time because I was definitely a wise guy. So the interview went comfortably. I was one of the lucky 25 children to be picked. And therefore, that's the way it was.
Right. One of 25 boys, and of course the Krauses also wound up picking 25 girls. So you were definitely one of the lucky ones, and you had that coveted immigration card. You know, I always remember when I first saw these cards when I was working on the film. I always sort of thought of these as those Willy Wonka gold certificates, because this was your magic card. What we're looking at, Paul, is your official visa card that allowed you to enter the United States. And you know, one of the things that I always love to point out to people that I discovered in the course of making this film and telling the dramatic story of the Krauses is that at this particular period of time, in 1939, somewhat unbelievably, it was easier for Jews to leave the city of Vienna than it was for them to find countries that would allow them in. In other words, we're talking about this period of the Nazi era where the Germans, where the Nazis, both in Germany and in Austria, wanted every Jew to leave, and indeed probably would have allowed everyone to leave, except for the fact that it was very difficult to find countries that would allow them in. So you were one of the lucky ones, and I'd love to know what your first impressions were when you arrived, or as you were preparing to arrive in the United States. I think food has something to do with it.
Yeah, it has to do with the German language and food. This is the funny part of the trip. We were on the boat, the President Harding heading up for New York from England, and they put food in front of me, and I only spoke German. And the first thing they put in front of me, they said, Paul, how would you like to have a hot dog? And in German, that meant taking a real dog and heating him up and serving him. And I said, my God, is that what they eat in the United States? No, they said it's a Frankfurter. That was another German word, which I did know what it meant. So I knew it was basically what we call a hot dog. The second thing that happened to me was there was a dish with some red material that was jumping back and forth on the table. And I thought to myself, I hope it's not going to attack me. What is it? They said, don't worry, Paul, it's just Jell-O. And it's not going to attack you, and you'll probably like it, even though it is red. And the last one, which was probably the funniest one, had to do with the subject of ice cream. They put in front of me a jar with beautiful looking ice cream with a topper of cherries and nuts and all kinds of wonderful stuff. And they said to me, Paul, here's an ice cream sundae, have a good one. And I said to them, what do you mean have a good one? Today is Tuesday. What am I going to do? It's going to be melted down completely by Sunday. And they said, no, that's just what we call it. It's just an ice cream, and you'll be able to have it right now. So that's an example of how you have language transference. And it was happy times.
Very good. Well, and to carry on with those happy times for you, and so fortunate for you and your family, as I think we're about to see, you settled in nicely once you arrived in the States. I've always loved this photograph of you, Paul, because you look like you've stepped out of the pages of Gentleman's Quarterly, the child's version. You're so nattily dressed. Tell us a little bit about those first few years in the United States for you.
Well, I was pretty lucky in all respects. First of all, when we arrived, we went to a summer camp at Collegeville, Pennsylvania, which was sponsored by B'nai B'rith, rather by Bris Shalom. And there we had a good time. We learned how to swim. We learned how to speak English. We learned how to play various types of sports. And I found it rather nice. And I was interviewed by a family that came out. These families were going to take a child if they could, and then take care of them until the parents arrived, or if they didn't arrive, maybe they would adopt them. And this family, the Amram family that lived in Feasterville, Pennsylvania, a suburb of Philadelphia, treated me wonderfully. I spent a year with them from August of 39 until June of 1940. Meanwhile, my mother arrived in beginning of 1940, but I did spend a good period of time with the Amrams, who treated me just like a son, and it was a good life. And I really enjoyed it. And then I was reunited with my mother and my grandparents in the summer of 1940, when they had settled into Washington Heights, New York, which is in Upper Manhattan.
And before too long, you had that great, carrying on that great tradition that so many 13-year-old Jewish boys had. I've always wondered, when I saw this photograph of you as a bar mitzvah, it's hard to imagine that only a few years earlier, you were at risk, as along with the rest of your family, of falling victim to the Nazis in Vienna. And it's always so touching for me to see this photograph of you celebrating your bar mitzvah in the freedom and safety of the United States.
Yeah, this was a great time, except for the fact that my father wasn't with us yet. He was held on an island, on a British island during the war. It's a long story, which I'm not going to go into, but he did arrive in 1946. And my bar mitzvah, of course, was in November of 44, when I was 13 years old. So we had a nice turnout, but it wasn't with my dad. And then later on, we were reunited totally in July of 46, when he arrived in Baltimore Harbor on a freighter. And then we were together as a family finally, after I hadn't seen him for about 7 years, since I left in 39, and I didn't see him until 46. But as again, I was very lucky the whole family was reunited, and we were ready to live a good, comfortable life in New York City.
And of course, Paul, the wonderful, truly heartwarming thing about the story of the Krauses is not just the lives of the 50 children who were saved, not just the lives of the parents who were lucky enough to be reunited with their children, but the generations that followed. And so in the fine tradition of Lador Vador, from generation to generation, from one bar mitzvah to another, why don't you tell us who we're seeing in this wonderful family photograph?
This is a very much later picture of us, with my grandson in the middle there, the little fella between the two big fellas. That was Sammy, and he was being bar mitzvahed. And this was a time when my mother was still alive. She lived to 99. We had some good family durations. My father lived to 93, and my diabetic grandfather lived to 97. So we did pretty good. Maybe it's a good sign for me. My mother's in the middle there, sitting next to my wife, the sweet girl. I don't call her Glenda. I call her the sweet girl. I've got her for 66 years. And I couldn't have had a better partner in the world. I was one of the luckiest guys, not only getting out of Vienna and surviving, but meeting the sweet girl and having her sitting here right now behind me as we do the film.
What a blessing, Paul. What a blessing. And how, what a thrill it is to have known you and Glenda for all these years. And as we wrap up this part of the discussion, I know that you've been so blessed with children, grandchildren, and the next generation to follow. So why don't you close with some thoughts about looking back and the blessings of your own family?
Yes, we were very fortunate in our own lives. We had three children. We had 7 grandchildren and 8 great-grandchildren. And a number of the great-grandchildren are shown in this particular picture, which just goes to show you the statement which I often make, it is, Hitler didn't do so well.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. And we'll come back in a few minutes to talk about a somewhat darker period in Vienna. But let's move on to the next part of our show today.
Hello again. Um, that was sensational. Thank you so much for sharing with us, Paul. Um, Stephen, something I noticed when I watched the film was I just thought you wove the story so beautifully. It's one of the it's a very challenging thing to tell a story where people know the ending. And when you're telling a story about a rescue or about, a historical event, sometimes we know the ending. And one thing I noticed that you did really well is you used music to help sort of communicate the emotional life of what was going on. I wanted to ask you a bunch of questions all about that because I thought it was just your choice of music was exemplary. We have some clips that we're going to roll. I was wondering if we could roll our first clip.
If I didn't care more than words can say, if I didn't care, would I feel this way?
There was word going around the streets of Vienna that there was somebody coming to Austria who wants to save 50 children.
And what makes my head go round?
I had never seen red polish. I just looked at them and thought how wonderful.
What on earth would go through my grandparents' mind to leave 2 children behind, leave the safety of their home, and go into Nazi Germany?
And would I be sure that this is love beyond compare?
I think about it a lot. I think they were just plain decent people.
Would all this be true if I didn't care for you?
Stephen, can you tell me a little bit about that song?
Sure. The Ink Spots. Huge smash hit for the Ink Spots, 1939. This was, Samantha, sort of all great things colliding together for me in terms of the decision to open the film with a somewhat unlikely song for a film that is about the Holocaust or the upcoming horrors of the Holocaust. But indeed, everything about that opening scene does not exactly indicate that we're about to see a Holocaust-related film. A stylish woman polishing her nails. I knew, and when I was working with my film editor, that we wanted to open this film in a very unlikely way. And one thing had always stuck out in my mind when I was interviewing some of the folks, particularly some of the women who had remembered Eleanor Kraus's red fingernails. So we came up with the idea to open it that way. And then I was thinking, okay, let's start with a piece of music that Eleanor Kraus might have been listening to or had on the radio in the background. And so I did a little musicology research. I simply Googled big hits of 1939. And there were a whole bunch of songs. There were probably some Sinatra tunes. There were certainly, Glenn Miller, big bands or whatever. None of that really worked. And then up pops the Ink Spots. Now, I knew a little bit about who the Ink Spots were. These were African-American singers, one of the first Black groups to be sort of crossover hits on radio. But I wasn't familiar with the song If I Didn't Care. But as soon as I listened to it, I knew, bam, that's the song, because it works on every level. It's a love song. It's a guy writing to or singing to a woman about how he loves her, and if I didn't care, none of this would matter, but I do care. And I suddenly realized that on so many levels that just hits the nail on the head in terms of introducing this couple, Gil and Eleanor Kraus, who not only loved each other, but obviously cared enough to go into Nazi Germany to rescue a group of children. So all these years later, I still get goosebumps when I hear that song, If I Didn't Care by the Ink Spots. because not to pat
Yeah.
myself too much on the back of the, but it was such a lovely way and an unexpected way to open this documentary film about a Holocaust rescue story.
Absolutely. It's also, I mean, the title is like, it's almost like so on the nose of when we look back in history, all these people who didn't do anything. It's that the fact that the Krauses they did care. It's so powerful. Something I always think about as an actor, and as a musical storyteller is this idea, you know, we always say stories are more exciting if you go from 0 to 100 than from 50 to 60. Because the audience won't know what's coming. And we have that great sense of, you know what I mean? If we start here and end here. And I think you do that so beautifully with this song. This song really, really does that so well for you. Because it starts us at one. It starts us at joyful.
Yeah, and if I could just add one very personal note as well, because I think about that when I see that opening clip. You know, the film never lets the audience know how it was that I, as a filmmaker, came to be able to tell this story of the Krauses.
Yes.
I certainly never knew them, but that opening clip includes a brief shot of their granddaughter, Liz Purley, who appears throughout the film talking about her grandparents. And that was my connection, because Liz was my wife. I met Liz 20 some odd years ago. We got married, and she's the one who first told me about her grandparents and shared this remarkable story with me, which in turn, some years later, led to the film. So even though I never knew Gil and Eleanor Kraus, they had passed away long before. And again, that opening scene with Eleanor polishing her nails and the ink spots singing that wonderful song from 1939, and being able to include Liz in that opening scene, for me was a very personal way of drawing people into that world. And I always felt very, very fortunate to be able to bring this story to light with all of these elements that we've been talking about.
Absolutely. It's so personal. I love it. Okay, let's roll the second clip.
Nobody, no Jew or non-Jew in Germany or in Austria or in any other country could imagine that the Nazis were going to kill the Jews. That people were so incredibly supportive of Hitler probably was a real shock.
Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Over the course of 2 terrifying days in November 1938, synagogues were burned to the ground throughout Germany and Austria. Jewish businesses were looted and destroyed. Men were beaten in their homes and on the streets. In the weeks that followed, thousands of Jewish men were rounded up and sent off to concentration camps.
This is a cello, right? We've got a cellist going on. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. A wonderful cellist and composer named Zoe Keating. I had heard a little bit of Zoe's music, and when we were deciding on what kind of music we wanted to match certain scenes, I immediately thought of Zoe because of this particular piece. This section of the film is all about the increasing danger and risk of what was happening to Jewish families in Vienna as Hitler was rising to power and entering Austria. Paul and I are going to talk in a few minutes about Kristallnacht, which is mentioned in the clip we just saw. And so I knew we needed a piece of music here that was sort of signaling the oncoming danger.
It's very, there's a lot of urgency. Like you get this great sense of like apprehension.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And indeed, the title of Zoe's piece is called Exurgency. And so it's that driving cello, it's that notion, you almost have a sense of impending danger in the song itself.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
and it's interesting, Samantha, because this piece of Zoe's, it actually goes on in her original recording, it goes on for like 9 or 10 minutes. And I think we used 2 or 3 minutes of it in the film, culminating in those horrifying pictures of Kristallnacht with the synagogue ablaze in Vienna. But again, it was an opportunity. There are obviously some dialogue in that part of the film, but for several, for large parts of it, it's just the picture we're seeing of what was happening in Vienna with this kind of ominous, dark-sounding cello that is, as you noted, is indicating a sense of urgency, which is exactly what the Jewish families in Vienna were confronting at the time. This notion that time is running out, and that particular piece of music, to me, says, hey, things are getting bad. It's time to try to figure out a way to get out of here.
I think you're absolutely, I mean, you picked another excellent selection that I think you made there. And I do think like if you had no dialogue over that section, we would still understand what was going on.
Absolutely.
We would say in musical theater that lyrics play to your brain and music plays to your emotions, which I think is such a great quote. Like sometimes if you heard a love song in a musical, if you didn't hear the lyrics, you'd probably still know what it was about because it speaks to you. And this is that there's such, this piece plays to emotion. There's such emotion attached to this piece. Yeah. All right. Should we do the third clip?
During the 10-day voyage across the ocean, the Krauses and Dr. Schless watched over the children and began preparing them for their new lives in America. The ship arrived in New York Harbor on the morning of June 3rd, 1939.
I love that piece. To me, that piece is so, it's wistful and it's yearning. There's something about strings. I mean, and it's different from the cello that we heard before. This you immediately can identify as violin.
Yeah.
Anybody knows that this is violin. You know, that old expression that they always say, you know, like, oh, I'll play a violin for you. Because we do. Like, it's a perfect example of why you would choose something like this. Correct me if I'm wrong, because it just expresses such want.
Yeah. Yeah,
It
absolutely.
cries. It cries.
Yeah. And I love talking about this piece of music, Samantha, because you're absolutely right. This piece of music had an interesting journey.
Yes, I love this story.
into the film. When I was working on the film, and filmmakers often work with what's called a temp track, a temporary track. So you'll just throw in pieces of music, songs, whatever. Well, I always knew that I wanted to end the film with this song, I
Wow.
had it on a CD of two musicians, Andy Statman and David Grisman. But that particular album of mostly Eastern European kind of Jewish songs, written by a bunch of different composers, and along with some traditional Hebrew melodies, was a very sort of klezmer-ish kind of recording. And this particular song, which is a piece called "For the Sake of My Brothers and Friends,"
Yeah.
written by Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach, who was known as the singing rabbi way back in the 1960s. He wrote a bunch of like folk songs. He had written this song, but the version I had was with a mandolin, and it was very klezmer-ish, very Eastern European, but I wanted the song. And when I was doing some fine tuning on the editing with the folks at HBO before the film premiered on HBO, they pointed out something that just hadn't really occurred to me. That is, the song was fine, but the musicality, the instrumentation, completely was at odds with everything else in the film, because the rest of the score in the film was cello and violin and a string quartet and a little bit of piano, and suddenly you've got this sort of klezmer mandolin kind of thing going on. And so I was given my marching orders basically by the head of HBO documentaries, Sheila Evans, who said, you know, Steve, if you want to keep the song, fine, but no mandolins. So I kind of panicked, and at the very last minute, I found a wonderful composer and film and stage scorer and arranger in New York, Fred Barton, who I got to through a mutual friend. And I said, Fred, I'm desperate here because I love this piece of music. And he turned around and almost overnight did an arrangement with a violin and a viola and a little bit of piano. And I knew I was saved, because I got to have this beautiful, wistful, as you said, melancholy, gorgeous song, and it worked so much better for this particular film without the mandolin.
The mandolin. I think it's so interesting to hear how a film like this comes together, and how something we don't think about as much when we're watching it. We don't think about the music until we really think about the music. All of the artistic choices that you've made to make the story come across as clearly as possible. It's just sensational. I loved talking about this with you. I think we are going to welcome Paul back up.
Let's bring in Paul, and Paul. This is a perfect transition, because in one of those clips that we saw that Samantha and I were just talking about, of course, we saw a little bit of the horrifying events that took place in November of 1938 in what became known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. And of course, this was only a few months before the Krauses arrived and picked you and the 49 others. But I have a feeling that you probably have some not very happy memories of what was happening in Vienna during that time. And I thought the audience would like to hear you talk about those very unfortunate memories of what was happening in Vienna during that time for you and your family.
Yeah, we had a personal experience in relation to Kristallnacht, in addition to all the things that were happening with the burnings and the lootings and people being sent to the concentration camps, including some of my relatives. They came up to our house, and our particular residence at 3 a.m, they pounded on the door, and they came right in with their machine guns, and they lined us up against the wall. I thought they were just going to shoot all of us, and that was going to be the end of it. But instead, they just asked for all the valuables, all the paintings, all the jewelry, all the silverware, anything that had any value, they were going to take. And my mother knew that this was likely to occur. And she had a little jewelry that she put in a jar and mixed it in black powder and marked it rat poison. So with the rat poison jar, they just left that alone. And the rest of it they took well, they left. And later, when my mother was able to leave for the United States, she was able to take that jar with her. and she had some jewelry with her that she was able to save, but most of the valuables, of course, were stolen. And that was an example of the kind of experiences that individuals had on that particular period of Kristallnacht, which was the official beginning of the Holocaust, because before then it wasn't quite as extreme. But once they got away with that, and they knew the world didn't really care, they knew they could do anything. Hitler at one time said, after the Turks had taken the Armenians into the desert and let them die in 23, he said, well, if they can do that, what are they going to say about the Jews? They're not going to worry about it because they don't really care. And unfortunately, in that tragic moment, Hitler was correct.
You're absolutely right, Paul. And it's interesting because in telling the story of Gil and Eleanor Kraus and their role as rescuers of you and the 49 others, indeed, in fact, it was in large part the newspaper coverage of Kristallnacht that they were reading a few months before they embarked on their mission that really kind of triggered in their own minds the need to kind of step up and try to do something. You know, as you mentioned in Europe, likewise in America, you know, a lot of people were just sort of sweeping this under the rug thinking, well, how bad can it be? Obviously, once Kristallnacht had occurred, as you pointed out, the world saw how bad it could be. And even though a lot of minds in our country, unfortunately, still were not changed in terms of let's do everything we can to rescue as many people as possible, fortunately, people like Gil and Eleanor Kraus got the hint and decided now is the time to step up and try to do something.
Right.
Well, I'm very excited to share this next clip with everybody. And indeed, we're about to see something that I don't think has even publicly been shown anywhere. We're about to see a 5 or 6 minute little video I made of Paul and Glenda Beller returning to Vienna. Just a little backstory for what we're about to see. When I was making the film, somewhat by coincidence, Paul and Glenda were scheduled to be in Vienna as part of a program organized by a group in Vienna known as the Jewish Welcome Service that had a program, at least at the time, to invite former Viennese families, particularly Jews, obviously, to return to Vienna as a way of saying, we'd like to welcome you back to Vienna, even though we understand how difficult it was at the time when you left. Well, when I was making the film, I thought here was this great opportunity to film one of the 50 children returning to Vienna. As it turns out, none of that, or almost none of that, showed up in the final film for a variety of reasons when I was making 50 children. So instead, a few years later, I decided to make a little sort of extra little featurette that I called Paul and Glenda Return to Vienna. And so I sort of feel like it's having its world premiere here. And I'm so delighted to share this little video clip showing Paul and Glenda returning to Vienna all those years later.
And it was a mixed neighborhood. I'd say that the vast majority of people there were probably Gentile. I liked Stumpergasse because it was a little bit off the beaten track. And in the wintertime, it was on a hill. So my father used to pull me on the sled. And sometimes he didn't have to pull me because on the downhill side, I just went all by myself until I got to the bottom of the hill. And then once the Anschluss occurred, of course, we lost everything. And I also remember the store that was right underneath where we lived. It was no longer being occupied by the same parties because unfortunately the gentleman was Jewish and he had to leave, and he left under very dire circumstances. I remember all of a sudden having people at home all day long because they didn't have in their businesses any longer. And you hear conversations about trying to get visas and trying to find ways out. And the very grim thoughts of, if you're not going to get one, are you going to be one of those that's not going to survive?
What you see are the immigration cards, alphabetically ordered. The IKG was closed after the Anschluss 1938, and after its reopening, the Jewish community was forced to organize the immigration by the NS authorities or Nazi authorities. And Jewish people who live in Vienna had the possibility to register at the Jewish community.
This is my card, Paul Beller. Stumpergasse 48 and number 19 was the apartment. My father was actually born in Poland. That made it more difficult for him because those people were often sent to the concentration camps. Introduce myself. My name is Paul Beller. Ich bin gekommen in 1939 von Wien mit 50 Kindern. They went by boat, Kindertransport nach New York, nicht nach England. Und jetzt machen sie ein
Stephen, Paul, thank you so much. And thank you for that beautiful clip. It's extraordinary to see you, Paul, return to Austria. I'm so glad we have that footage. Well, folks, it's almost time to wrap this evening up. This has been such a pleasure to be your MC and to get to be a tiny part of tonight. Before I go, I would like to introduce Dr. Mordecai Paldiel, who I know you all know, but just in case, he is the world's expert on Holocaust rescue and serves on the board of the Sousa Mendez Foundation. He headed the Righteous Among the Nations Department at Yad Vashem from 1982 to 2007. He is a prolific author and teaches at Stern College and Touro College. And thanks to his efforts, there is now a square named for Aristides de Sousa Mendez, which was inaugurated just a few weeks ago. I don't know if you guys remember when I told you earlier that we were the lead piece in the forward this morning. So that's what that's all about. Very exciting stuff. He's here to tell us a little bit more about the Sousa Mendez Foundation. And don't worry, I pinky promise you will still see Olivia Mattis before the night is through. Thank you all so much.
So hello, everyone. I just want to say a few things about myself. To start, before joining the Sousa Mendez Foundation, I headed for 24 years the Righteous Among the Nations department at Yad Vashem that honored non-Jews who saved Jews from the Nazis. Currently, as a member of the Sousa Mendez Foundation, under the leadership of our foundation head, Dr. Olivia Mattis, I continue to be involved in highlighting humanitarian deeds under a program spearheaded by Dr. Mattis's Sunday film and discussion programs, such as the story of Gilbert and Eleanor Kraus, just recently discussed, and many others portrayed these past years. I want to say at this point, we are not yet finished with the Kraus story, for we plan to nominate these two wonderful people for the Jewish Rescuer Citation under a program of the B'nai Brit office in Israel, with which I am associated, that honors Jewish rescuers of Jews done at considerable risks to themselves. I wish to point out that the Kraus story is especially unique and that a Philadelphia couple engaged themselves in a rescue mission without any organizational or major organizational backing, but strictly on their own. And it happened at the same time when the United States government refused to allow the passengers of the St. Louis boat to disembark on US soil. It happened in the spring of 1939. Although these passengers had been approved for immigration to the United States, but had to wait their turn for about 2 years. What a contrast between these two stories. The powerful United States refusing to admit 927 refugee Jews, and a lone Philadelphia couple negotiating with the Nazis the release of 50 Jewish children. Oh yeah, there's also the Wagner-Rogers bill for the admittance of Jewish children on the example of the British Kindertransport, but vetoed by none other than the US president. But we have no time here to discuss this shameful story. But I just wanted to bring the context of what the Kraus operated. And I just want to mention in passing that here in the United States, at that same very time, you had a movement and a surge of anti-Semitism. Father Coughlin. You had Charles Lindbergh, famous Charles Lindbergh. You had the German-American Bund at the Madison Square Garden. So admitting Jewish refugees to the United States was not very popular. You had a lot of anti-Semitism. And I'm afraid what's happening today in the United States, we're returning to that same period as in 1939 with regard to anti-Semitism. But I want to go on, and I just want to mention what we are doing here at the Sousa Mendez Foundation. And I want to underline that to facilitate the continuation of these programs that involve much advanced planning, we need your financial support. So please help us so that audiences may continue to be inspired with similar stories of humanitarian courage that we intend to present in the coming months. It is with your help that we will demonstrate that the individual person can make a big difference in the right direction, in the direction of a better humanity. Your partnership in this endeavor, by your generous contribution with a year-end donation to the Susan Mendes Foundation or a season ticket subscription for the next year, this will help us to continue highlighting unknown stories of individual acts of goodness performed under difficult and risky situations. So, in closing, many thanks for your assistance in this important work, and hope we'll meet again on one of our next Sunday programs. Thank you very much. Olivia, it's your turn.
Thank you, Mordechai. And thank you, everybody. Thank you to our speakers and our audience. I want to echo what Mordechai said and entice you all to get season tickets for 2023. If you do, you will get Stephen Pressman's book, 50 Children, about the Kraus story as our thank you gift for supporting us. And now we're going to show you a little tiny video clip to entice you to sign up for next year, showing some of our upcoming programs.
If I didn't care more than words can say, if I didn't care, would I feel this way? If this isn't love, then why do I thrill? And what makes my head go round and round while my heart stands still? If I didn't care, would it be the same? Would my every prayer begin and end with just your name? And would I be sure that this is love beyond compare?
So see you all in 2023. My thanks to you all. Happy holidays. Happy New Year. See you next year. Bye-bye, everybody. Be well. Bye-bye.